In July 2025, something remarkable happened, and hardly anyone noticed. After 22 years of silence, Australia quietly reopened its market to Canadian beef. No headlines, no grand signing ceremony. Yet this small-sounding decision could redefine how the democratic world feeds itself. Because behind that move lies a deeper strategy, a new corridor of food security, trade trust, and green logistics linking two resource superpowers, Canada and Australia. This is Geocapitalist, and today we decode Australia and Canada's new food trade corridor that's quietly redefining global supply chains. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe, because this channel doesn't chase headlines, it decodes them. In July 2025, Australia's Department of Agriculture officially lifted a 2-decade ban on Canadian beef imports, a restriction first imposed in 2003 during the global BSE outbreak. The announcement, confirmed by Reuters and Australia's Biosecurity Agency, restored Canada's access to a market closed for almost a generation. For Canadian ranchers, it was more than symbolic. It meant recognition that Canada's food safety system now ranks among the most trusted on Earth. Australia's decision followed months of joint review with the World Organization for Animal Health and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. Scientists combed through inspection data, traceability standards, and feed control measures. Their verdict: Canada's surveillance system for animal disease met or exceeded every modern benchmark. But the timing was not coincidence, it was strategy. Australia's cattle herd had fallen to its lowest point in a decade after successive droughts, high slaughter rates, and growing export obligations to Asia. Importing limited volumes of premium Canadian grain-fed beef provided flexibility for processors facing volatile supply. Meanwhile, Ottawa was searching for new trade openings after the global supply chain chaos of 2020 to 2023, a period when pandemic lockdowns, port backlogs, and inflation exposed just how fragile the world's logistics really were. With Asia tightening its shipping networks and the U.S. market reaching saturation, Canberra suddenly represented something different, a stable democratic gateway into the Indo-Pacific. A partner that could help Canada diversify beyond its continental limits and rebuild resilience one shipment at a time. Behind closed doors, agricultural attachés described the reopening as a reset of Commonwealth reciprocity, a phrase hinting that food security is now treated like energy policy, strategic, not secondary. So this wasn't nostalgia. It was calculus. A quiet but calculated move inside a world where nations now compete for reliability as fiercely as for resources. Forget the hype. This isn't a $12 billion mega deal, but it's far from trivial. In 2024, Canada imported about $316 million in meat from Australia, while Australia exported roughly $109 million of beef to Canada. These numbers might seem small compared to oil or lithium, but for agriculture, they mark a high-trust corridor between two of the world's strictest food safety regimes. With the ban lifted, analysts expect total two-way flows could rise to $400 to $500 million annually within 5 years. Add in feed grain shipments, frozen storage investments, and maritime logistics, and the corridor could easily exceed $1 billion in overall economic activity. The multiplier effect is huge. Ranchers, truckers, port workers, and freight insurers all benefit. Each additional $100 million in beef trade supports an estimated 1,200 Canadian processing jobs and hundreds more in Australia's distribution chains. Ports like Vancouver and Fremantle gain steady traffic in refrigerated containers, a lifeline for shipping companies seeking stable cargo during global slowdowns. Canadian analysts at Agri-Food Canada forecast that by 2030, bilateral meat and agri-food trade could represent nearly 0.1% of Canada's GDP, a small slice numerically, but a major symbolic leap for post-pandemic diversification. In geopolitics, symbolism matters. It tells the world that open democracies can still form value-driven trade corridors amid rising protectionism. So while it's not a trillion-dollar headline, the impact is real, in jobs, logistics, and credibility. This isn't just about meat, it's about trust economics, proving that transparency itself can be a tradable asset. Because they mirror each other, geographically vast, resource-rich, and democratically aligned. Both nations are continental in scale, but modest in population, exporting far more than they consume. They manage similar challenges: extreme climates, labor shortages, and dependence on maritime trade routes, and both are strategically repositioning within the CPTPP, the most advanced trade alliance of the Pacific century. For Canada, deepening ties with Australia is a chance to prove leadership beyond North America. Ottawa's Trade Ministry views Canberra as a trusted twin economy, one that shares similar environmental and labor standards, unlike many developing suppliers. For Australia, aligning with Canada balances its dependence on East Asian markets, especially China, which still absorbs over 30% of its exports. Culturally, the trust runs deep. Both nations share Commonwealth roots, English legal systems, and public accountability models that investors respect. They collaborate in Five Eyes intelligence, Arctic research, and now food security, weaving a network that extends from military intelligence to supermarket logistics. This partnership also symbolizes a philosophical pivot, a move away from chasing volume toward building resilience. In an era where supply chains fracture under political pressure, Canada and Australia are demonstrating that reliability itself can be a geopolitical asset. So when diplomats call this the Commonwealth Food Security Corridor, they're not exaggerating. What seems like a simple beef agreement is actually a prototype, a living model for how democratic nations can secure essentials, hedge against authoritarian leverage, and strengthen economic sovereignty across oceans. Timing is everything, and in Canberra, the timing was deliberate. Australia's cattle herd had fallen below 24 million head in early 2025, the lowest level in more than a decade. The cause? Years of intense drought under El Niño, record slaughter rates to meet Asian export demand, and slow herd rebuilding. Domestic processors faced shortages, while food service prices spiked. Importing limited volumes of Canadian grain-fed beef offered breathing room, stabilizing supply, supporting restaurants, and keeping export contracts intact. But the move wasn't just about logistics, it was politics. Australia's government needed to show G7 and CPTPP partners that it was committed to open markets, not selective protectionism. Reopening to Canada's beef signaled that Canberra could give as well as take, an act of reciprocity timed to strengthen its bid for broader access to Canadian wheat and barley markets. Behind closed doors, officials also discussed climate diversification. By drawing beef from Canada's cooler regions, Australia could reduce pressure on its own drought-prone pastures while maintaining export consistency. For Canadian producers, it meant new footholds in Asia-Pacific supply lines, routes that had once been monopolized by New Zealand and the United States. It was also a diplomatic gesture. After years of China's trade coercion against Australian exports, Canberra wanted to deepen ties with democracies that shared its values and supply chain standards. Canada fit perfectly, stable, science-based, and politically reliable. So, while the decision came wrapped in biosecurity language, it was truly a message. The era of one-way trade dependency is ending. Canberra reopened its markets not out of sentiment, but out of strategy, strengthening alliances that reward trust, not just tariffs. Under the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, Beef tariffs between Canada and Australia are now effectively zero, giving both nations frictionless access to each other's markets. That's what makes this trade corridor so efficient. No new deal was needed. The framework already existed. What changed was the political will to use it. Despite the distance, a 14-hour flight or a 3-week sea voyage, both nations have built a logistical ecosystem designed for reliability. Specialized refrigerated containers, known as reefers, move between Vancouver, Prince Rupert, Fremantle, and Melbourne, with precise temperature tracking that meets both countries' food safety standards. These routes, originally designed for seafood and dairy, now accommodate high-value beef shipments, diversifying cargo portfolios and reducing freight costs per ton. Each country exports to distinct consumer segments. Australia's grass-fed frozen beef targets Canada's mass retail and food service sectors, known for cost-sensitive buyers. Canada's grain-fed marbled cuts enter Australia's premium steakhouse and hospitality markets, products that domestic suppliers rarely produce at scale. This complementary structure prevents head-to-head competition while keeping both industries profitable. Processing rules further blur national borders. Imported Australian beef, once trimmed, seasoned, or packaged in Canada, can legally be labeled processed in Canada. The same applies in reverse, turning supply chains into hybrid systems rather than zero-sum exchanges. Ports, freight companies, and storage facilities are now investing millions in smart cold chain monitoring systems, part of a broader technological integration wave across Commonwealth logistics. In effect, this corridor doesn't just ship products, it exports standards. It's a proof of concept for how democracies can synchronize infrastructure to make food and energy trade nearly seamless. Technically, this isn't a brand new free trade agreement, but it might be more important than one. The July 2025 reopening operates under a market access protocol supervised by the CPTPP, binding Canada and Australia to mutual sanitary and phytosanitary standards. It's less political showmanship, more quiet engineering, the kind of bureaucratic diplomacy that keeps food on tables and trust intact. Signed between the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, CFIA, and Australia's Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, DAF, the protocol certifies Canada's food safety and traceability systems for both chilled and frozen beef. The verification process involved more than a year of audits, on-site inspections, and cross-referencing with World Organization for Animal Health guidelines. In essence, it's a science-based handshake, data instead of speeches. The agreement also establishes working groups on traceability technology, methane reduction feed, and low-carbon logistics, connecting agricultural innovation funds in both countries. These projects reflect the new reality. Agriculture isn't just about land anymore, it's about data, sensors, and carbon footprints. Behind the scenes, officials from Ottawa and Canberra are already treating this as a pilot program. If the model works for beef, it could extend to dairy alternatives, fertilizer, agri-tech exports, and even carbon-neutral shipping fuels. In diplomatic language, that's called a pathway agreement, a test run for billion-dollar cooperation later. It's quiet diplomacy at its most effective. Instead of press conferences, there are spreadsheets. Instead of slogans, measurable standards. Yet within those numbers lies strategy, a methodical buildup of trust that forms the backbone of 21st century trade. It shows that the real architecture of globalization is no longer political summits, but interoperable systems. Every corridor has friction, and this one is no exception. Beneath the optimism of trade lies a complex web of exposure, competition, and environmental debate. For Canadian ranchers, the return of Australian imports means new price pressure at home. Australian beef, especially grass-fed frozen varieties, often undercuts Canadian producers by as much as 15 to 20% per kilogram. That creates a price squeeze on small and mid-sized farms already struggling with feed costs and inflation. Critics warn that without careful quota management, domestic supply chains could suffer the same fate as dairy exporters did under earlier free trade openings. In Australia, allowing foreign beef during periods of drought remains politically sensitive. Rural lobby groups, including the National Farmers Federation, have voiced concerns that Canadian imports could distort local markets when domestic supply tightens. Reciprocity sounds elegant in a communiqué, but on the ground, it can mean votes lost in ranching districts. Then there's the environmental factor. Shipping frozen meat halfway across the world increases carbon intensity, not just from fuel, but from energy-intensive cold storage. Analysts estimate that if both nations doubled beef trade without adopting greener logistics, annual emissions could rise by up to 70,000 tons of CO2 equivalent. Both governments are now evaluating carbon offset schemes and biofuel-powered freighters to neutralize that risk. Finally, the geopolitical layer. By linking their food systems so closely, Canada and Australia become mutually exposed to global price swings and trade retaliation. If demand in Asia falters or if tariffs reappear in a future trade dispute, both sides would feel it immediately. Yet policymakers argue that the alternative, isolation, is far riskier. In a world where resilience equals power, shared exposure is also shared strength. The challenge isn't to eliminate risk, it's to manage it together. This isn't a headline-grabbing super deal, it's a strategic realignment, a deliberate repositioning of two nations that understand the new rules of global trade. In the 20th century, power revolved around oil. In the 21st, it revolves around trust. And what Canada and Australia are building right now is a trust-based supply chain, a network of democracies trading not just goods, but governance. By relinking their food systems, they've quietly proven something remarkable, that global cooperation doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. This is not about scale, it's about signal. A corridor valued in the hundreds of millions today could evolve into a $5 to $6 billion Commonwealth agri-network by 2035, spanning beef, grains, fertilizers, bioenergy, and smart logistics. Analysts at the OECD already note that such democratic corridors reduce commodity price volatility by nearly 25% compared to authoritarian supply chains. Investors are paying attention. Sovereign funds in Singapore, London, and Toronto are exploring exposure to cold chain and logistics firms that service this new route. For capital markets, predictability is gold, and this partnership offers it. For Canada, the corridor strengthens its position as the connective tissue between Europe, the Pacific, and the Commonwealth. For Australia, it expands its influence beyond Asia, balancing dependence on its largest trading partners. For the world, it's a blueprint, showing that economic sovereignty doesn't have to come at the expense of cooperation. In an era when resources are used as tools of leverage, this partnership turns reliability into strategy. It's not flashy diplomacy, it's functional geopolitics. A quiet alliance built on data, discipline, and mutual confidence. And that's why historians may look back and say, this was the moment Canada and Australia quietly rewrote the rules of food security for the democratic world. This is Geocapitalist, decoding Australia and Canada's new food trade corridor that's quietly redefining global supply chains. If you found this breakdown valuable, check out our next video. It connects directly to what's unfolding across the Commonwealth. And don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps us decode these shifts without compromise. Let us know in the comments. Is food security the next great frontier of geopolitics, or just another trade story? Either way, the future is connected. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.